Namaskaram. The first question I've been asked today is by TV Murali. What he says is, according to me, man has free will only to choose whether he wants to realize the self or not. The rest are predestined. Is my understanding correct? No, it isn't exactly like that. What is predestined is our prarabdha. Our prarabdha is the fruit of actions that we've done in the past, in past lives. The actions that bear fruit are called agamya. The fruit of agamya done in each life gets stored in what is called sanchita. Sanchita means a heap or pile. So that is the store of all the fruits of all the agamya that we've done in past lives that we haven't yet experienced. From that sanchita, which is a vast pile, because in every life, generally, we accumulate more fruit than we experience, because we have many more desires than we're able to experience. So the sanchita is an ever-growing pile. And so God or Guru selects from that which fruit we are to experience in this lifetime. And being all loving and all compassionate, he chooses those fruit that will be most beneficial for our spiritual development. So whether what we experience in this life seems to us to be good or seems to be bad, that's only from our narrow viewpoint. It's actually all for our good, for our ultimate good, because the ultimate good is only attaining mukti. That means annihilation of ego. And so everything, all that we are given to experience according to prarabdha is what is conducive to our advancement on the spiritual path, coming closer to the point where we are ready to surrender this ego entirely. So where does freedom of will come into this? Freedom of will, that is agamya, are the actions, that is the agamya of the actions that we do but bear fruit. Agamya are those actions that we do driven by our will, according to our will. So what is predetermined is the prarabdha, which is the fruit of actions that we've done by our using our free or misusing our freedom of will in the past. So according to Advaita, these three karmas, this is how they're classified in Advaita. In different systems of Indian philosophy, all except karma, except the Charvakas or materialists, but all other systems of Indian philosophy, whether that is including Buddhists and the Jains and everyone, they all accept karma. But each have their own way of understanding it. According to the Advaita, this is the thing, there are three karmas. That is the actual karma. Karma means action. So the actual action is only the agamya. The sanchitra and the prarabdha, they're karma pala, the fruit of actions. That is the results of the agamya that we've done. So without freedom of will, we couldn't do agamya. And without agamya, there wouldn't be any fruit. And without fruit, there wouldn't be any prarabdha. So according to Advaita, and Bhagavan generally what Bhagavan teaches about karma is in agreement with this. There is no incompatibility between freedom of will and predetermination. What is predetermined is what we are to experience. That is the fruit of actions that we've done in the past by our freedom of will. Coming down to the question more closely, what you say, Murali, is you use this English term free will. This is a term that is very commonly used, but it's actually a very loosely defined term. What Bhagavan was far more precise when he talked about these things in Tamil, but generally in English, when people talk about free will, what they mean is freedom to do what one wants. And freedom to do what one wants that is not actually freedom of will, that is freedom of action. So Bhagavan was very precise. He distinguished, we have two types of freedom. The fundamental freedom is the freedom of will, that he called Icha Swatantra. As a result of our freedom of will, we also have freedom of action, that is Kriya Swatantra. These are obviously closely related. If we had no freedom of will, it would be meaningless to say we have freedom of action, because freedom of action means freedom to do what we want, according to our will. So if we had no freedom of will, in effect, we would have no freedom of action. So they are closely related, but they are two distinct freedoms. Bhagavan often spoke about them collectively because people are most interested in actions. So, and since the freedom of action is dependent upon freedom of will, Bhagavan often spoke about Icha Kriya Swatantra. But he also, when he was discussing the subject more precisely, he would distinguish the two. That is, freedom of will is unlimited, because that is, Swatantra is often translated as freedom, but more precisely it means independence. So independence of will, that is, no one can make us want what we do not want or stop us wanting what we do want. So we are totally free. Our will is totally free. The only limitation on the freedom of our will is that we want many things, and often the things we want are contrary to each other. So there's often conflict within our will. That is the only seeming limitation. And also, because we want so many things, our will is scattered in so many directions. Often people talk about lacking willpower. What lacking willpower means, we all have willpower, but when our will is scattered in many directions, it's not focused, and so it seems to be weak. That is, I want this, but I want that, and I want that, and I want that. We want so many things, we end up not focusing on any one thing. So our freedom of our will is totally free. Of course, that within the limitations of our existence as an individual, that is. Our actions, obviously not totally free. Our actions are limited by, our freedom of action is limited by circumstances and so many things. But we do generally have freedom of action. And it's because we have freedom of action, when we misuse that freedom of action, we do agamya. And the agamya bears fruit, which eventually gets ordained for us to experience as prarabdha. So the agamya, what we do, the actions that we do by our will, are not constrained by predetermination. That is, though we have freedom of action, we don't have freedom. We have freedom to try to get what we want, to make effort to get what we want, to do actions to get what we want. We don't have freedom to get what we want, because what we are going to experience is according to destiny. So we've got no freedom to achieve what we want, but we've got freedom to try to achieve what we want. Because what we are to experience is predetermined, and in order to experience what we are destined to experience, there are certain actions of mind, speech, and body that we need to do, or we wouldn't experience what we destined. So those actions we are made to do. That is what Bhagavan refers to in the first sentence of the note he wrote for his mother. Avarava prarabdha prakaram adakanavan angangirtu artavipan. That literally means according to their prarabdha. That means according to the prarabdha of each person, adakanavan, he who is for that means God or Guru, Angangirandu, being there. I mean, being in each place, implying being in the heart of each jiva. Artavipan. Artavipan literally means will cause to dance. In other words, he will make them act. So we'll be made to do those actions that are necessary in order for our prarabdha to unfold. Many people, without thinking about this deeply, they at once come to the conclusion, Bhagavan has said all the actions we do are according to prarabdha, and we're made to do. That is not what Bhagavan said. Those actions that are necessary for us to experience, that's why he said according to prarabdha. That is, in order for us to experience the prarabdha, we will be made to do whatever actions are necessary. So for a simple example, supposing it's our destiny to become a doctor or an engineer. In order to become a doctor or engineer, we need to study. And we need to pass exams and everything. So our body, speech, and mind will be made to do those actions that are necessary in order for us to become an engineer or doctor. It's as simple as that. That doesn't mean that all the actions we do by body, speech, and mind are according to destiny. Generally, most of the actions we do are according to our will. Bhagavan made this clear in the next two sentences of that note he wrote to his mother. He said, Endrum naduvadadu, enviachikunum navuvadu. That means what is never to happen will not happen in spite of any amount of however much effort is made. In other words, however much we try to experience what we are not destined to experience, we cannot experience it. So if everything was predetermined, there would be no need for Bhagavan to say there, enviachikanam, whatever effort is made, because if it's all predetermined, even all efforts will be predetermined. So good. But the fact he added that whatever effort is made, because though we cannot change, we cannot experience what is not destined, we're not destined to experience, we can want to experience it, and we can make effort to experience it. So there Bhagavan is clearly indicating we have freedom of will and freedom of action. But we don't have freedom of getting what we want. And then in the next sentence, he says the same thing he says the other side of the same coin. He says, Nadapadu, what will happen, entadeseinum Uڵḷadu. Whatever obstruction is done, Uڵḷadu will not stop. So what is not to happen, what is never to happen, will not happen, however much effort we make. What is to happen will not stop, however much we try to obstruct it. Iduvetinnam, this is certain. Ahalin monamayirikainandru. Therefore, being silent is good. So here Bhagavan clearly indicates that though we cannot change what we are destined, what is predetermined, what we're destined to experience, we can want to change it and we can try to change it. But wanting to change it and trying to change it is futile because we cannot change it. It's as simple as that. So we do have freedom of will, and that freedom of will is not only concerning attaining self-realization. Even when our mind is, in order to attain self-realization, we must use our freedom to turn our attention within. But when our attention is turned outwards, we have freedom. We have freedom to try to achieve things or not to achieve them. I'll just mention one thing on the side here, because one question people often ask is, how do I know which actions are destined and which actions are according to will? We do not know, and we cannot know. And we need not know. There's no point in knowing, because what is destined to happen is going to happen. So why Bhagavan taught us that what is destined to happen is going to happen? In order to make us understand we need not be concerned about these things. It's not to make us think more and more question, more and more, raise more and more doubts and objections. It is to, if we understand the intention of what Bhagavan taught us, we don't have to worry about what is going to happen in our life, because what is going to happen is already predetermined. Regarding action, those actions that we will be made to do according to destiny, we will be made to do. So we need not worry about those actions. The only actions we need be concerned about are those actions that we do by our will. By default, we can say, most of the actions we do are according to our will. Even those actions we do, but are according to prarabdha, they're also often driven by our will. That is, so to use the same analogy again, supposing it's our destiny, our prarabdha, to be a doctor. So we have to study hard and we have to pass the exams in order to become a doctor. So we are made to do those actions according to destiny. But most people who become doctors, they not only is it their destiny to become a doctor, they want to become a doctor. They may have different reasons for wanting to become a doctor. Some people who become doctors may want to become doctors because they want to do service to people. They think it's a good, noble profession where they're helping others, alleviating suffering thing. Some people may think it's a high prestige job. To be a doctor gives you social prestige. Other people may think, oh, it's a very good way to earn money. I can get a reliable income from being a doctor. So there may be different motives, but most people who study to become doctors, they want to become a doctor for one reason or another. So not only is that action driven by destiny, it's also driven by their will. So the vast majority of actions we do are driven by our will, whether or not they're also driven by destiny. So, but the problem lies not in the actions, that is, the actions are an effect. The problem lies in the will. The will is the cause. So it's at the level of the will that we need to tackle the issue. This is why it is said in the path of self-surrender, the path of self-surrender begins by our trying to surrender ourselves trying to surrender our will to the will of God. That is not my will, thy will. We are trying to not act according to our will, but only to yield us, surrender ourselves to God. Whatever you want, that is what is good for me. I accept that. So surrender always begins with surrendering our will. If we didn't have a will, as some people try and claim, or we didn't have freedom of will, we couldn't surrender it. So the whole path of surrender would become meaningless. You couldn't even begin on the path of surrender, or on any spiritual path for that matter, if we didn't have freedom of will. And freedom to act according to our will. So we do have that freedom. So as I say, we don't have to be concerned about the actions because the actions are being driven by our will. So if we want to avoid doing agamya, we need to go to the root of the problem. The root of the problem is our will. So what does our will consist of? Our will, in its grossest form, our will is desires, attachments, fears, hopes, and all these things. So these are a grosser manifestation of the will. At a slightly subtler level, our likes and dislikes. That is, it's our likes and dislikes. If we like something, then we desire to get it. If we dislike it, we fear it, or we desire to avoid it. So underlying the desires and the fears and the attachments and so on are our likes and dislikes. And underlying the likes and dislikes are what are called vasanas or samskaras. These two words mean the same. Bhagavan generally talked about vasanas, but sometimes also samskaras. So vasanas or samskaras means our inclinations. So it's the inclinations that give rise to likes and dislikes, which in turn give rise to desires and fears and so on, which in turn give rise to all other thoughts and ultimately to everything. Bhagavan has said the whole world is nothing but a projection of our own vasanas. So the vasanas it's at the level of vasanas that we need to tackle this problem. But whose vasanas are they? In other words, whose will is it? Obviously, it is ego's will. So the ultimate root of all problems is ego. That is the problem that we want to get rid of. But so long as the vasanas can very broadly be classified in two types. there is what are generally called Vishaya Vasanas. Bhagavan often uses this term Vishaya Vasanas. What Vishaya Vasanas means is Vishaya means phenomena. Anything other than ourselves, anything that appears and disappears is a Vishaya. Any object is a Vishaya. And Vasana means an inclination. So our inclination to experience Vishayas, to experience things other than ourselves, they are called Vishaya Vasanas. That's one type of Vasana. The opposite type is what Bhagavan called Satvasana. Satvasana means is the inclination just to know and to be what we actually are. So if we cultivate the Satvasana, we'll get more and more liking to turn within and more vairagya towards, in other words, our Vishaya Vasanas will be weaker. We'll have less inclination to go outwards and more inclination to go within. So our aim when practicing the spiritual path is to weaken our Vishaya Vasanas and strengthen our Sattvasana. Ultimately, our aim is to surrender ourselves completely. When we surrender ourselves, since ourself means ego, it's ego that we have to surrender. When ego is surrendered, when ego is surrendered, everything else is surrendered along with it. But in order to surrender ego, we must be willing to surrender ego. And so long as we've still got strong Vishaya Vasanas, we will not be willing to surrender ourselves, to surrender ego. So the spiritual practice is a process of weakening our Vishaya Vasanas and strengthening our Sattvasana. Our Sattvasana is what is otherwise called bhakti. And the weakening of our Vishaya Vasanas is called vairagya. So it's at this level of our vasanas that we need to deal with it, to deal with the problem. When we allow our attention to go away from ourselves, we are being swayed by our Vishaya Vasanas. When we're being swayed by our Vishaya Vasanas, now we come to a point where there is freedom at different, as I said, the will, there are different levels of the will. The grossest level is desires and so on, subtler than that of likes and dislikes, subtler than that of vasanas. Likewise, at each level, there is corresponding freedom. That is, we are free to desire whatever we want or not to desire it. Or we may have certain desires, but we consider to be bad desires. So we are free to try and overcome those desires, to give up those desires. So we can do it at that level. But coming down to a level of vasanas, vasanas are inclinations. Though we have certain inclinations, we are not bound to follow those inclinations. So the real freedom of will, the crucial freedom of will, is that we are free either to allow ourselves to be swayed by our vasanas or not to allow ourselves to be swayed by our vasanas. And at this level, we can see throughout the day, all sorts of inclinations arising in our mind. We are constantly, if we are serious about following this spiritual path, we're constantly discriminating whether to allow ourselves to be swayed by this vasana or not. Just to use a very simple example, supposing we have a strong inclination, supposing we like food a lot. So we've got a strong inclination to eat food. But we know that if we eat too much food, we'll make ourselves sick. So though we may have inclination to eat more food, we also don't have an inclination to avoid getting sick. So at a certain point, we decide, okay, I shouldn't eat anything more, because if I eat more, I'm not going to feel well. So the inclinations are, the inclination on one hand to eat more, and the inclination on the other hand not to eat anymore, because we know it's going to make us sick. So we can follow either of these inclinations. We have that freedom. If we're wise, we avoid overeating, and so we maintain our health and everything. If we overeat, we become sick and have to suffer the consequences. But even those consequences is actually according to prarabdha, because many things that we do seem to produce an immediate effect. But it's not actually, because whatever we experience, it is according to destiny. But destiny is not randomly selected. Destiny is tailor-made to suit us. So Bhagavan knows what vasanas we have. how much we are likely to yield ourselves to certain vasanas, and he has ordained the prarabdha accordingly to suit that. So these things are not at all random. That is, the prarabdha is very carefully selected. How does Bhagavan select it? Does he sit there scratching his head, which karma shall I select for you? No, he doesn't. How he does it is just by being himself. As he says in the 14th paragraph of Nāṉ Ār, no, sorry, not 14th, I mean 15th paragraph, I mean. The 15th paragraph, Bhagavan says, just as in the mere presence of the sun, which rose without icha, that's liking or wish or desire, sankalpa, volition, or yatna, effort, a surya kanta, that the sunstone emits fire, lotus blossoms, water evaporates, and people of the world commence their respective karyas, activities. They do those karyas and they cease doing them. And just like in front of a magnet, a needle moves. Jivas who are subject to the threefold function of God or the fivefold function of God, which happen, this is the crucial bit, which happen by just the special nature of the presence of God. That is, everything that Bhagavan does, including the ordaining the prarabdha, he does without doing. By his mere presence, all these things happen. So the ordaining, the selection of the fruit of our prarabdha is happening by the mere presence of Bhagavan, by his just being as he is. Because what is Bhagavan? Bhagavan is infinite love. So out of his infinite love, these things happen automatically. So our prarabdha is selected by him without him doing anything, but merely by the, as he says here, by his Sanidana Vishesha Matrata, by the mere special nature of his presence, of his being what he is, in other words. Everything, so as I say, the prarabdha is tailor-made to suit our vasanas and which vasanas we're most likely to yield, to allow ourselves to be swayed by. But we do have, we always have choice. Whenever any vasana arises, any inclination arises, we have a choice whether to follow that inclination or not to follow it. If we didn't have that choice, no spiritual practice would be necessary. And we wouldn't, all the actions we do wouldn't be according to our will, it would be according to destiny, which would make the whole karma, the law of karma, it would invalidate it, because without acting according to our will, there'd be no agamya, and hence there'd be no fruit, and hence there'd be no prarabdha. So it makes the whole thing meaningless. So freedom of will is very important, and at the most fundamental level, what the freedom we have is we are free to be swayed by our vasanas or not to be swayed by them, and to be swayed by this vasana or that vasana. So applying this to the path that Bhagavan has taught us, which is the path of self-investigation and self-surrender, the vasana we should yield ourselves to, the vasana we should allow to sway us, is the sat vasana. We should try to avoid being swayed by other vasanas. This is how we weaken the vasanas. That is, whenever any vasana sprout in the form of likes, dislikes, desires, thoughts, and everything, whenever any vasana sprouts, arises, we can either allow ourselves to be carried away by that, or we can cling firmly to self-attentiveness. If we cling firmly to self-attentiveness, we are thereby weakening that vasana that rose, and we are strengthening the sat vasana. That is what we are doing in the spiritual path. The question you've asked, Murali, this is a question many people ask, because unfortunately, in the books, what Bhagavan has Bhagavan explained in great detail and very, very clearly about this, these two types of freedom, Ichya Swatantra and Kriya Swatantra. But it has not, unfortunately, not been recorded in any books clearly. And many of the people who recorded the books didn't understand clearly what Bhagavan was talking about. So many of the, Bhagavan often spoke in a very nuanced way. So if they miss the nuances and record it, it gives quite a different meaning. So in some books it's recorded, particularly in books by Devaraja Mudliar, who was a very good devotee, but he always had difficulty understanding this. Once Devaraja Mudliar said to Sadhu Om, one thing I could never understand, if Bhagavan says we've got freedom, we've got Ichya Swatantra and Kriya Swatantra, but he also says everything is predetermined. I could never understand how these seem to me to be contradictory. So I often used to ask Bhagavan about this. And Bhagavan explained it to me many times. And every time he explained it to me, I thought I had understood it. But then after some time, I would think about it more. And then I would again get confused. And I would again go and ask him. So Devaraja Mudliar had difficulty understanding this. But he's recorded what he remembers Bhagavan explaining. And unfortunately, because he didn't understand the nuances in what Bhagavan was saying, what he's recorded has confused many people. He's recorded, I can't remember, I don't have it on hand now, what he's recorded, but he's recorded as if Bhagavan said, the only freedom you have is to turn your mind within. What Bhagavan meant there is the only freedom you have to free yourself from this cycle of karma is to turn your mind within and thereby not identify yourself with the mind, speech, and body, but of the doers of act, which are the instrument by which actions are done. So there's a lot of confusion about this subject. Bhagavan never said that the only freedom we have to free ourselves from this is to turn within. That doesn't mean that the only freedom we have is even when our mind is going outwards, we have freedom whether to follow this vasana or that vasana. If we didn't have that freedom, all the Bhagavan himself says in one place in talks, when someone asked him about freedom, Bhagavan said, so long as there's ego, so long as there's individuality, there is freedom of will. And all sastras are based on this. Because what would be the meaning of, what would be the purpose of any sastras? Sastras are to tell us what we should do or what we shouldn't do, or to give us guidance. What would be the purpose of any sastras if we had no freedom? We must have freedom. So we do have freedom. And that freedom is key to, using our freedom correctly is very, very important. Regarding the thing about freedom of will, Bhagavan has said very clearly, for example, in verse 19 of Uḷḷadu Nāṛpadu, he talks about the dispute about which prevails, fate or will. This is an age-old dispute that has been going on in philosophy, not only in Indian philosophy, Western philosophy, all philosophy, whether everything is predetermined or whether there is freedom of will. And if there's both, then which prevails? What Bhagavan says about that is, in verse 19, he says very beautifully in Tamil, Vidimati Moolam Vivekam Ilake, Vidimati Vellam Vivadam. That means the terms he uses here, he doesn't actually use the term freedom of will, he just talks about the will. But obviously it implies freedom of will because the dispute wouldn't arise if there wasn't an assumption of the possibility of some freedom of will. So what he says here, only for those who do not have discernment of the root of fate and will is there the dispute about which prevails, fate or will. So what does he mean here by the root of fate and will? Who is it who has will and who is it who experiences fate? It is only ourself as ego. So the root of fate and will is ego. Only for those who do not understand when he says vidimati moolam vivekam, that means discernment or the ability to think, only those who do not recognize that ego is the root of both will and fate will dispute about which prevails, fate or will. According to Bhagavan, this dispute is meaningless. Why? Because there is no conflict between will and fate, because they each have their own domain. What we want to experience, that is according to our will. What we are to experience is according to fate. So there's no dispute. I mean, what we want to experience cannot change what we are going to experience, and what we're going to experience cannot change what we want to experience. I may want to be a doctor, but if it's not my destiny, I cannot become a doctor. But just because it's not my destiny to become a doctor doesn't stop me wanting to be a doctor. I can be wanting to be a doctor up to the last days of my life, but it's not my destiny, so I won't be a doctor. So there is actually no conflict between fate and will. It is only those who do not understand the nature of ego who imagine some sort of conflict between fate and will. So Bhagavan is clearly here, he's indicating, yes, so long as there's the root, so long as there's ego, there is fate and there is will. When ego is found to be false, then both fate and will are found to be equally false. So the whole karma theory is based upon the fact that we have risen as ego. If we investigate this ego, we'll find we have never risen as ego, and therefore there never was any karma. But so long as we rise as ego, fate and will both, each prevails in its own domain, but it cannot encroach into the domain of the other. And then he says in the next sentence, Viti matigaku o mudal tanne onanda ave tananda. That means those who have known themselves, who are the one themselves, here means ego, but he implies who have known the reality of ego, ego, who is the one origin of fate and will, have discarded them. That is, if we want to be free of both will and fate, we need to investigate this ego. If we investigate ego, we will know what is the reality of ego, which is Satchit, the pure awareness I am. When we know that, we have thereby discarded both fate and will, because without ego, there's neither fate nor will. And then he says, Savaro pinnum ave satru. That means say, will they thereafter be associated with them? So Bhagavan clearly acknowledges both will and fate, but he clearly implies here the root of, he clearly teaches here that the root of both is ego, and that there's no conflict between them. So I hope this has helped clarify that. Murali, do you want to ask anything further on this, or does anyone else have any questions further on this? I see there's some questions written in the chat. Okay, there's one question here I see in the chat. I don't know about the YouTube chat, but in this chat, are all our future karmas predetermined? It seems that God alone would know when one would get self-realization, and however many lifetimes in the future, he would know all our future actions. Generally, I mean, we don't have to analyze this too. Ordaining the fruits of karma is God's job, not our job, so we don't have to worry about it. But generally, how it is explained is that for each lifetime, God ordains the prarabdha for that lifetime. So when each lifetime begins afresh, when we begin a fresh lifetime, a fresh allotment of prarabdha. So what we are to experience in future lives, we can, not that it really matters, we can say, no, it is not yet predetermined. It will be predetermined only when we take another life, if we take another life. Regarding self-realization is not the fruit of a karma. Bhagavan says very clearly, in Upadēśa Undiyār, in verse 2 of Upadēśa Undiyār. Oh yes, this was another verse actually I was going to refer to. But anyway, I'll talk about it now. What Bhagavan says in verse 2 of Upadēśa Undiyār is Vinayam vilevu vilevitu vittai, Vinay kadal virtidum undipara, vidu tarilile undipara. What that means is, the fruit of action having perished, as seed, it causes to fall in the ocean of action. It does not give liberation. What this means is, that is, when the fruit of a past action is selected for us to experience, when we experience it, that fruit is thereby perished. I mean, the analogy that is used here, obviously, is the analogy of the fruit that we eat. If someone gives you a mango, once you've eaten the mango is no more. You can't eat the same mango again a second time. Once it's eaten, it's eaten. Likewise with the fruits of karma. Once it's experienced, that fruit has, as Bhagavan says here, it's perished. However, when you've eaten your mango, what are you left with? You can eat all the flesh and all the skin, but what are you left with? You're left with the seed. And that seed, if it's planted in the ground, it can sprout and grow into another mango tree, and you get lots of mangoes. So likewise with actions, the real problem with action is not the fruit of action, it's the seeds. The seeds here means the vasanas. That is, when you do an action, we can see this with ourselves. Supposing you've got a bad habit, supposing there are many people who smoke cigarettes, for example. The more they smoke cigarettes, the more inclination they have to smoke cigarettes. So that's why people find who have started, maybe in their teenage years, they started smoking. And when they get older, they may understand, smoking is not good. It's not good for the health. It's foolish to smoke. But it's very difficult for them to give up. Why? Because the more they smoke, the more of that inclination to smoke is there. So to break that inclination is difficult. So it's the seeds. The seeds here means the vasanas. So whatever action we do, it has two types of results. One type is the karma pala, which gets stored in sanchitra and may later be experienced as prarabdha. The other is the vasana, that is the seed. That is what causes us to fall in the ocean of action. So the problem is not the actions or the fruit. The problem is the seeds. That's why I said Bhagavan never denied that we have will or that we have freedom of will. The seeds are our inclinations. But as I said, we are not bound by the inclinations. So that's the first sentence. Then Bhagavan concludes this verse by saying it does not give liberation. That means karma does not give liberation. So whatever karma you do, you can do all sorts of good karmas. However much good karmas you get, what do you get by doing good karma? You get punya. What do you get by doing bad karma? You get papa. But neither punya nor papa can give liberation. That is karma, that is mukti, is not a karma pala. It is not the fruit of an action. So when do we get mukti? Only when we surrender ourselves. Surrender is not according to destiny. Surrender is when we weaken our outward going, our vishaya vasanas and strengthen our sat vasana, we eventually become willing to surrender ourselves. What did Bhagavan often say? Bhagavan often said, Bhakti is the mother of jnana. Bhakti means love. Bhakti in this context means the satvasana, the love just to know and to be what we actually are. That is what gives liberation, and that is not the fruit of an act of a karma. So when we will get liberation, whenever we are willing to surrender ourselves, we get liberation. So that is not, liberation is not predetermined. So to say God knows when we'll get liberation, what is God? God is nothing other than our own self. In the view of God, we are ever liberated. So this is, it's meaningless to say that God knows when we'll get liberation, because in God's view, we're always liberated. It's only in our view that we're in bondage. And Bhagavan says, so long as we take, in verse 39 of Uḷḷadu Nāṛpadu, Bhagavan says, only so long as one thinks, I am bound, are there thoughts of bondage and liberation. So who thinks I am bound? It is only ego. So in God's view, there is no bondage. It's only in the view of ego that there's bondage. But and then he goes on to say, when one looks at oneself as to who is the one who is bound, and when oneself is thereby, and when oneself thereby remains accomplished, oneself who is eternally liberated thereby remains, thought of bondage and liberation, thought of bondage will not remain, so will thought of liberation remain. So thoughts, bondage and liberation are true only from the perspective of ego. From the transcendent view of God, there is no bondage and no liberation. There is only what is. I think I'll go on with the other questions that I've been asked, because I've already taken up most of the time on this question, but this is such an important question. Thank you for asking this, Murali, because this is something that people are so confused about. And many devotees of Bhagavan have completely, I mean, I've seen so many ways in which people misapply this thing about this idea that we don't have freedom of will. There are some people who behave inappropriately and say, I can't help it, it's all according to destiny. I know literally people who claim to be practicing Atma-vichara. They're saying, I'm not responsible for my actions, it's all according to destiny. And I mean, there's one particular person who often used to write abusive comments on my blog. He would often be saying, no, it's all according to prarabdha. He would be abusing other people, but he'd be saying it's all predetermined. I'm not free to. So this is a complete misapplication of Bhagavan teaching. Another way in which people misapply it, they say everything is predetermined. Even your thoughts are predetermined, so you've got no control over your thoughts. Bhagavan never said that. So it leads to so much. If we don't understand what Bhagavan taught us about freedom of will and about destiny, is actually very simple. But people, if we're ready to put aside all our old beliefs and just pay attention to what Bhagavan actually said, what Bhagavan actually explained, it's very, very simple and easy to grasp. We have freedom of will, and we also have, but whatever we are to experience is predetermined. The two are not in any way in conflict. And the freedom of will, we need not be concerned about what is predetermined, because it's predetermined. We've got no freedom in that respect. But we do have freedom with respect to our will, and we should use that freedom wisely. The wisest way to use our freedom is to turn within and to try to hold fast to self-attentiveness. And even when we allow our mind to come outwards, not to be swayed by our, that is to minimize the extent to which we're swayed by our Vishaya Vasanas. And if we are swayed, only to be swayed by suitable Vishaya Vasana. Thinking about Bhagavan, thinking about Bhagavan's teachings, praying to Bhagavan, reciting Arunachal Stuti Panchakam, Bhagavan's words. All these are if we allow ourselves to be swayed by vasanas, let us be swayed by these vasanas which are conducive to our going deeper in following this path. We shouldn't we should try to avoid being swayed by the more worldly or the more harmful vasanas. So we have that freedom. Otherwise we can say, oh, I'm not responsible for my actions. I can do all sorts of bad things because it's all destiny. So you can't blame me. That is, anyone who thinks in that way has not really understood Bhagavan teaching. There was another thing I wanted to say. There's a very good example in talks. In talks, it's recorded on the 30th of May, 1936. In section 190 of talks, there's an incident. some devotee had been sitting on the hill in the hot sun, meditating on the rocks. And then in the evening, when Bhagavan was, there was a pet squirrel. I'll just read a little bit of it. There is a pet squirrel in the hall which usually retires into its cage before nightfall. Just as Maharshi was telling it to retire for the night, a visitor who had announced that he had attained the transcendent consciousness suggested that water may be offered to it, since it was likely to be thirsty in the hot evening. His presumption to understand animals evoked no response. He repeated it. After a few minutes' silence, Maharshi said, "You are probably thirsty after your long meditation in the hot sun on the hotter rocks, and you would like to drink a jug of water." "Quite so, I have taken water," replied that person. And Bhagavan said, "The squirrel is not so thirsty. Because you were practicing austerities in the heat of the sun, you should feel thirsty. Why prescribe it for the squirrel?" And then Bhagavan added, "I noticed him standing on the hot rocks facing the sun with eyes closed. I stood for a while but did not want to disturb him and came away. These people do as they please." And then that person said, "What I did not intend beforehand. It was spontaneous." And Bhagavan replied, "Oh, I see. Whatever we others do, we do with intention. You seem to have transcended all." And that person then said, "This is not the first time I did so. You yourself inspire me and make me do all these things. Yet you ask me why I did it. How is it?" And Bhagavan says, "I see. You're doing actions controlled by me. Then the fruits should also be considered similarly to be mine and not yours." And that person said, "Yet so they are, undoubtedly. I act not of my free will, but inspired by you. I have no will of my own." And what does Bhagavan say? Enough of this rubbish. And then he quotes something from Mahabharata where Duryodhana said something to the same effect. So according to Bhagavan, anyone who claims I'm acting without any will, according to Bhagavan, it's rubbish. We all have our will in the form of vasanas, and we are responsible for whether we allow ourselves to be swayed by our vasanas or not. That is up to us. We have that freedom either to be swayed by our vasanas or to refrain from being swayed by them. So we all have freedom of will, and we must use it responsibly. That is Bhagavan's teaching. So as I say, Murali, thank you for asking this question, because it's a very important subject, but it's a simple subject. All we need to do is to understand it clearly, and there'll be no confusion. I probably won't get through all the questions I've been asked, but I will go on, see how far I get. The next question was asked by Advait. What he has asked is, Brahman is eternal and everything goes back to the source one day. What was the need for manifesting as Maya? Couldn't all the drama be avoided? Brahman has never manifested as Maya, or if it has manifested, it's not a real manifestation. That Brahman ever, as you say, it's eternal, and Bhagavan. That is, Brahman means what is real. What we actually are is eternal, unchanging, and self-shining, as Bhagavan often said. So since being eternal and unchanging, it never does anything. It never undergoes any change. So it always remains just as it is. Maya, Bhagavan has explained, Maya is nothing but our own mind or ego. There's no Maya outside ourselves. It is Maya, that is what is called Maya, is nothing but ego. So who has risen as ego? If we, whenever people ask, why has ego, or why is there Maya, or why is there ego, or what caused it? Bhagavan used to say that, or why or how? These are the questions people often ask. How did Maya come into existence, or why did Maya come into existence? Bhagavan said that's the wrong question. Maya is nothing but ego. If you investigate ego, you will find there's no such thing. Since there's no such thing, asking how or why it came into existence is like asking how or why the son of a barren woman was born. There is no such thing as the son of a barren woman, so to ask how he was born or why he was born is meaningless. Likewise, Maya means ya ma, what is not. Ya means is a feminine form of what, and ma means not. So what is not is Maya. So, and as Bhagavan often said, Maya is nothing but ego. If we investigate this ego, we'll find there's no such thing. That is ego. Now we seem to have risen as ego, but as ego, we're always looking away from ourselves at other things. So long as we're looking at things other than ourselves, we seem to be ego. But if we as ego turn our attention back to investigate ourselves, we will find that the ego will, as he says in verse 25 of Uḷḷadu Nāṛpadu, Tedinal autum pidicum. If sought, it takes flight. That is, if we investigate this ego, it will subside and dissolve back into its source. And in other words, we'll find there never was any such thing as ego at all. So your final question, couldn't all the drama be avoided? The ultimate truth is there never was any drama. There seems to be a drama only when we look away from ourselves. Look back at yourself to see what you actually are, and you will see that you are always the immutable Brahman and never anything other than that. So there never was any drama. So Advaita, I hope that answers that question of yours adequately. And then Gulshan had asked, is there any effort required to be in self-abidance, or is it divine grace which makes it happen, as and when it finds the seeker ready and receptive? Effort is required, and it's all divine grace. Both are true, because what is divine grace? Grace is nothing but what is Bhagavan's nature? Bhagavan is the one infinite whole. So, since Bhagavan is the one infinite whole, he sees nothing other than himself. And he has infinite love for himself. So since he sees nothing other than himself, whatever seems in our view to be something other than him, in his view is nothing but himself. So Bhagavan loves us all as himself. His infinite love for us as himself is what we experience as grace. And since Bhagavan is nothing but our own real nature, Bhagavan is that which is always shining in our heart as eye, grace works from within. So it is grace that has attracted us to this path. It is grace that gives us love to follow this path. And whatever effort we make in this path is a result of the love which is given by grace. So ultimately everything is grace, but that doesn't mean that effort is not required. Effort is absolutely necessary. Because, why? Because the natural tendency of ego, of mind, is to go outwards, to attend to things other than itself. So we need to make effort to go within. So effort and grace are both absolutely necessary. The grace manifests in us in the form of the love to make the effort that is required in order to merge back in our source. So both are absolutely necessary, and both the effort is entirely dependent upon grace. Bhagavan often used to say, grace is the beginning, the middle, and the end. What does that mean? It is grace that draws us to this path. So it's the beginning. It's grace that gives us the love to follow this path. So it's the middle. And finally, when we turn within, it is grace that will swallow us. So grace is the end. So all is grace. Without grace, there is nothing. So grace is absolutely essential, but the grace manifests in us in the form of that love and the resultant effort to turn our attention within. So in order to benefit fully from grace, we need to surrender ourselves to it. We need to yield ourselves to it. And since grace wants nothing but for us to turn within, turning our attention within and holding on to I am, that is surrendering ourselves to grace. And what gives us that love to surrender ourselves to grace, and therefore make that effort to surrender ourselves? It is only that grace. So grace is everything. But that doesn't mean effort is not necessary. Effort is also necessary because grace works through our effort. I hope that answers that adequately. There are more questions. Okay, I just see one question here. Can I become a doctor purely by the effort as a result of my will? Yes, if it's your destiny to become a doctor, you can become a doctor. If it is not your destiny, you will not become a doctor. However much you may want to become a doctor, you cannot be a doctor unless it's your destiny. That's what Bhagavan says. What is never to happen will not happen, however much effort you make. What is to happen will not stop, however much you try to obstruct it. So you're becoming a doctor. You can become a doctor only if you're destined to become a doctor. You may, as I said, most people who become doctors also want to become doctors. So the effort they make to become a doctor is driven both by destiny and by their will. In other words, the two happen, in that case, to be coinciding. But if you're destined to be a doctor and you want to be an engineer, somehow or other you'll fail all your exams to get into engineering college and you'll end up with second best option. I have to become a doctor. So whatever is to happen, that is all that we are to experience in our life is wholly determined by prarabdha. That is why, and since we will be made to, since our body, speech, and mind will be made to do whatever actions are necessary to experience our prarabdha, we don't actually have to be concerned about actions at all. The only thing we need to be concerned about is turning our attention back within and holding fast to I am. Let everything else go on as it's meant to go on. It will all take its own course. But if instead of holding on to I am, if we allow our attention to come outward, we'll unnecessarily be making efforts according to our will. By mind, speech, and body, we'll be doing action by mind, speech, and body according to our will, and thereby creating thereby doing a gamya and creating karma pala to add to the already huge pile in Sanchita. So our aim should be the only wise use of our will is to turn within and cling fast to I am and let everything else go on according to God's will. And I see another one. Can you give us an example of will versus destiny? For example, if I want to become a doctor and I work hard towards it, but it's not my destiny to be a doctor, then how does will work here? Well, according to your will, in this case, it's not actually a case. That is, you say will versus destiny. One thing that's very necessary to understand here is that will and destiny are two different domains. Each prevails in its own domain. So sometimes we may want things, but we're not destined to experience, or we may want to avoid things that we are destined to experience, but our will cannot change what is destined to happen. Likewise, what is destined to happen cannot change what we want. Just because it's not, if it's you can want to become a doctor and you can try hard towards it, but if it's not your destiny, you won't become a doctor. So the fact that it's not your destiny to be a doctor doesn't prevent you wanting to be a doctor. So your destiny is not having any impact on your will, and your will is not having any impact in your destiny. They're two separate domains. But what is the one thing that is common? Who is it who has a will? Who is it who experiences destiny? That is the one ego. So it's two sides of the same ego. One side ego has will. The other side, it has to experience its destiny, which is a result of its misuse of its will in previous lives. Okay, there's another question from Krishna Kumar Sampat has asked, when I try to be aware of I, is it the false I or real I or ego? Okay. Ego is what we can call the false I, but actually there are not two I's. There's only one I. We can understand this with the simple analogy of the snake and rope. Supposing you're walking along a path in the dim light of dusk with Bhagavan, and you see something lying on the ground that you think is a snake. So you're afraid. So you stop and say, oh, Bhagavan, careful, careful, there's a snake there. Bhagavan knows very well it's a rope. So Bhagavan tells you, no, it's not a snake. It's just a rope. Look at it carefully and you'll see. He's asked you to look at it carefully. But if you then ask, what do you want me to look at carefully? Should I look at the snake or at the rope? That's a meaningless question, because what you take to be a snake is actually a rope. Likewise, this false I, that is ego, is nothing but the real I. That is the difference. They are one in substance. But the difference is only the upadis. That is what you call the real I is just that fundamental awareness of our own existence, I am. When it remains just as I am, that is our real nature. When it's seemingly mixed with adjuncts, as I am this body, that is ego. But the I is always one. So if we look at that one I, which now seems to be ego, we will see what we actually are, which is just that pure awareness I am, a pure I am. So the only difference is I am mixed with adjuncts, it's called ego. I am without adjuncts, it's called Brahman or Atma-vichara or whatever else you want to say. And then someone else has written, if there is deep hurt and pain due to someone's wrong action towards self, there is a lot of hatred towards that person. How can one get relief from this? There is a hurtful self-cry for justice and prayer for punishment towards this person, the tormentor. Okay. That is, whatever happens to us is according to prarabdha. That prarabdha is the fruit of our past actions as selected by God. So no one can hurt us or cause us any trouble, but we are not destined to experience. And what we are destined to experience is the fruit of our past actions. So we shouldn't see the cause as that person. The cause is the fruit of our past action. And who has given us that fruit to experience now? It's only Bhagavan. So Bhagavan often used to say, whether we call it prarabdha or God's will, it's one and the same thing. But on the spiritual path, on the path of surrender, it's useful to take it as God's will. Okay, it's the fruit of my past action, but the fruit of my past action selected by God, selected by Bhagavan for me to experience now. Therefore, why did Bhagavan put me in this situation where this person is causing me deep hurt and pain? It is what is good for me. So, okay, this is Bhagavan's will. I should bear it. It's natural for us to feel resentment and even maybe hatred against that other person, but we shouldn't. That is another Vishaya Vasana. That's a very harmful Vasana. We shouldn't yield to that Vasana. Instead of yielding to that Vasana to hate that person or to resent that person, we should give no room for that Vasana at all. Right? We should think, this is Bhagavan's will. Who has hurt me? Bhagavan has hurt me for my own good. So whatever Bhagavan's will, he knows what is best for me. So whatever may have happened to me, however deeply I may have been hurt, Bhagavan, this cannot have happened without Bhagavan's will. Right? That nothing can happen. Bhagavan is all powerful, so nothing can happen that is not allowed by him. And he's all knowing, so it cannot happen without his knowledge. And he's all loving, so it cannot happen without. He would only allow things to happen to me that are good for me. So however bad it seems to me, it's actually good, what is good for me. So since Bhagavan has allowed it to happen, I should feel no resentment to that person. I should just feel gratitude to Bhagavan, because though I don't understand why this has happened, why Bhagavan has allowed this to happen to me, since he's allowed it to happen, it must be what is good for me. In this way, we stop the mind going outwards into harmful channels of feeling hatred and resentment and so on. We turn the mind, keep the mind in check, and we surrender it to Bhagavan. Surrender everything to Bhagavan. That is the practical way. Otherwise, we will continue being hurt. Nobody can hurt. Why? How do people? It often seems to us that circumstances of life or people's actions hurt us. But why do they hurt us? Because of our likes and dislikes. Supposing you had neither likes nor dislikes, nobody could do anything to hurt you. It's only they hurt you because of your likes and dislikes, you are hurt by certain circumstances. People may say some harsh words to you, some unkind words to you, which hurt you. Why are you hurt by that? Because you like to be people to praise you and to like you, and you dislike being people putting you down or speaking unkindly to you. So that's why I said the whole spiritual sadhana, it happens all at the level of the will. That all problems start. Well, the root of all problems is ego, but the next level is our will, our vasanas. So if we are able to give up our likes and dislikes by surrendering our will to Bhagavan, nobody can hurt us in any way whatsoever. And then someone else has asked, for manonasa, is only effective path are there self-inquiry, self-surrender? What about yoga marga and karma marga? That is, there are many different types of spiritual practice. Ultimately, the only path by which we can what is it? Manonasa. Manonasa means destruction of mind. That means eradication of ego. What is ego? Ego is nothing but a false awareness of ourselves. That is, as ego, we're aware of ourselves as I am this person. I am such and such a person. Since ego is a false awareness of ourselves, it can be eradicated or destroyed only by correct awareness of ourselves. So in order to achieve manonasa, we need to know what we actually are. And how can we know what we actually are if we don't investigate ourselves? If you want to see something, you have to look at it. If we want to see what we actually are, we need to look at ourselves. In other words, we need to turn our attention back within. So ultimately, self-investigation and self-surrender, which are one and the same thing. It's just two ways of describing the same path, because we can't surrender ourselves completely without turning our attention within. So whatever other path we may follow, ultimately, we need to turn our attention within. So ultimately, self-investigation is the only way to annihilate ego. Other paths if it's the path of karma and bhakti, that's a means of purifying the mind. As Bhagavan explained in the early verses of Upadēśa Undiyār, particularly from verses 3 to 8 of Upadēśa Undiyār, Bhagavan is talking about the purification of mind. That is by karma and bhakti. Bhagavan doesn't see karma and bhakti as two separate paths. That is, when he talks, karma yoga is the path of nishkarmiya karma. But how to do action without desire, unless we do it for the love of God. So when in verse 3 of Upadēśa Undiyār, Bhagavan doesn't just say nishkarmiya karma. He says kartanukakam nishkarmiya karma. That means nishkarmiya karma done for God. That implies done for the love of God. So only that will purify the mind. But what purifies the mind is not actually the action itself, but the love with which it's done. Because you can do the same action, for instance, puja or japa or dhyana, you can do that for the love of God. You can also do it because you want to fulfill your desires or gain power or something. So what matters is not the action, but the love with which it's done. It's a love that purifies the mind. So for Bhagavan, the Bhakti Marg, that is the preliminary stages of the Bhakti Marga, are karma yoga. And whatever karmas we can do, karmas, actions by body, speech, and mind, this is puja, japa, and dhyana. These are the actions we can do. If we do these for the love of God, they will purify the mind. Each one more effectively than the previous one. That's more effective in puja is japa. More effective in japa is dhyana. Bhagavan explains that. But most effective of all is ananya bhava. That is, instead of taking God to be something other than ourselves, meditating on I alone with the conviction that He is I. That's what he calls ananya bhava, in other words, self-investigation. So that's a means of purifying the mind. When the mind is purified, as he says in verse 3, kartanu karkam nishkarmiya karma karti tirti aktunipara, that is, that nishkarmiya karma done for God will purify the mind and gativari kam become. It will show the way to liberation. What does he mean by show the way to liberation? Only when the mind is sufficiently pure will we recognize that the only way to liberation is to turn our attention back within and surrender ourselves completely. So, in other words, the purified mind is necessary in order for us to come to this path of self-investigation and self-surrender. So, this is the path of self-investigation and self-surrender. This is the pinnacle of the path of bhakti. Yoga is a slightly different path. Yoga is all about chittavritti nirodha, controlling the activity of the mind. But merely controlling the activity of the mind is not an adequate goal in itself. Why? Because every night when we fall asleep, we control the activities of the mind and fall asleep. Without a cessation of the chittavrittis, we wouldn't fall asleep. So the yoga path it's a path that's suited to people with a strong sense of doership. But Bhagavan says in verse 14 of Upadēśa Undiyār, that is one of the main techniques of the karma yoga, Raja Yoga, the yoga marga, is pranayama. Pranayama is a means to calm down the mind, to reduce the activity of the mind. But if you take it too far, it will lead to laya, which is a state like sleep. In other words, what they call nirvikalpa samadhi, according to Bhagavan, that's just a state like sleep. It doesn't help to destroy the vasanas, as he illustrated by that story of the yogi on the banks of the Ganga who went into nirvikalpa samadhi for 300 years. And when he woke up, the first thing he asked for was water. The last thought before he went in was the first thought when he came out. That means even the most superficial, even the vasana on the surface of the mind was not destroyed. So how can other vasanas be destroyed? So going into nirvikalpa samadhi or manolaya is not going to help us spiritually. So before the mind goes into manolaya, when we calmed it down to a certain extent, we should then send it on what Bhagavan calls orvari. Orvari, it can be translated as one path, but another deeper meaning, it's a path of investigation. In other words, a path of self-investigation. So if you're attracted to following that yoga marga, you can it's okay to calm down the mind to a certain extent, but then you should make use of that calm mind by turning back to this path of self-investigation. So ultimately, whatever other path you may follow, you have to come to this path of self-investigation. Other paths are ancillary. They may be helpful, but they cannot take you to a goal.